thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone is healthy and suffering nothing other than cabin fever as we kind of go through this rather unusual set of circumstances. So I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to build a crystal report from scratch today. And I really only want to build one report, but I want to kind of modify it several times so I can contrast and several different devices that we use when we build reports. In our second session, we'll talk about modifying existing reports and forms, which you may use crystal reports for as well. So I'm going to build a report from scratch, and so there's in any Windows product, there's lots of different ways to do the same thing, but there's a new button, or I could click File and New, or I could click the New button down below. But once I start building a report, one of the first things we have to do when we build a report is we have to choose where the data is coming from. And the first time through, that's a little bit tricky. Once you've built your database connection, it will show up under history and you're able to select it again and again. But I'm going to go ahead and build one from scratch just to see how it's done. And so I'm going to choose to create a new connection. And then we're going to use an OLEDB connection. And I'm going to define that a little bit further. So once I select OLEDB as my database connection, depending upon what version of Counterpoint, you will choose either an OLEDB for SQL Server or the native 11 client for SQL Server. And the difference is if you're on 8.5.6, you will use the SQL Server native client. And if you're on anything prior to that, you will use the OLEDB for SQL Server. So I am on 8.5.6, so I'm going to choose the SQL Server native client. And once I choose that, I have to select my server name, which takes a minute or so, enter a user ID and password, and select the database that I want to use for my reports. And so the user ID and password we're talking about here would be not the Windows user ID and password, but the SQL user ID and password. So for most of you, that's probably going to be a user of SA, and many of you may have a default instance of Counterpoint or of SQL Server, which uses Counterpoint 8 as your SQL password, which happens to be my secret password. Now you all know it. And so I've entered my SQL user, my SQL password, and then I'm able to select my database. There we go. And so my Red Sox database happens to be a demo golf database. So you'll notice I have multiple databases here for different testing purposes and production purposes. So I'm going to select the database that I want to use. And when I hit finish, now in my connection string, I've got my database. And if I expand the database, you will see information schema and sys. You're never going to do anything in either of those. Everything is done under the database owner. That's what DBO stands for. And so this gives me access to all of the tables, views, and stored procedures that are located within that database. And so again, I'm going to expand the tables, and this is going to give me access to all of the tables in the database, and further down, all of the views in the database and all of the stored procedures that are within the database. And for our kind of training purposes today, we're going to focus on inventory. It's an easy thing for to build a report around, and it tends to be where you tend to build most of your reports based on inventory and history. So the item table is probably one of the most common tables to join to a report. So I'm going to select that. And to select a table to include with the report, I can double click on it, or I can use the arrows to select it. So I'm going to build the report based on the item table, which is going to give me item numbers, descriptions, categories, subcategories, vendor information, and I'm also going to choose my inventory table. And the inventory table is going to give me quantity on hand information and location specific cost information. So in the inventory table, I'm going to have one record for every warehouse or for every location I have per item. So I have 3 warehouses in this database. So for every item, I'm going to have 3 records in my inventory table. So I've selected my inventory and my item table, and it doesn't really matter which one's on top and which one's on the bottom yet. So when I click next, it's going to bring me to a place where I'm going to link the 2 tables based on what's common between the 2. And again, items and inventory are really pretty easy to wrap our heads around. They both have a common item number. Not every table link is as simple as that. You'll also notice, looking at the screen, some of these columns have little flags in front of them, or little pennants. And what that indicates is that that column is an index and a key to the record. And so if we can link based on columns that have a pennant in front of them, the database linking occurs much faster. If I were to link based on some other field much further down, like for example, the vendor number, my linking would be much, much slower. And in this particular instance, it's not going to make a difference, but I usually like to be in the practice of doing this. And I usually like to build my tables from left to right. And what I mean by that is I want to put my primary, most important table on the far left-hand side. And that's really going to be my item table in this particular instance. That's going to be the driving factor of what appears on my report. I might filter it by categories, I might filter it by price points, but I'm really going to be filtering and doing most of the driving from the item table. So I want that on the left-hand side. And we'll talk more about that when we incorporate some sales history into this report. But that will get us started. So at this point, I can continue with the wizard to build the report, but I really don't like using the wizard, so I'll just hit the finish button. So at this point, I've got a blank report. And so in my layout section, I have layouts for the report header, the page header. So the page header is the top of each page. The report header is the top of the first page. The details is really the meat, what we're putting on the plate. And the report footer would appear at the end of the last page, and the page footer appears at the bottom of each page. And just by default, they slapped out the page date and the page number. And I'm going to delete those for now, because we're going to show you where to find that information. And before we start dropping things on the page, you'll notice there's a ruler across the top, and there's also hash marks going down the left-hand side. And you may notice these little triangles here. And these are little tab selects, kind of like the old typewriter days where you could place tabs every half an inch and align things to your tabs. And that's a handy way to drop things on the page, because once they're dropped on the page, they form nice, neat columns. And when you move the tab, everything that's linked to the tab moves with it. So it makes it a little bit easier to line your data up. And that's also really helpful if you plan on using Crystal Report Writer to export data to Excel. You want those columns to line up. Otherwise, you'll find you'll have 3 columns linked together with data. So let's start putting some stuff on the page. So on the right-hand side, I've got my Field Explorer. And you may notice every now and then the Field Explorer will close, or you'll close it accidentally. It's not the end of the world. Just click on the button to reopen the Field Explorer. So the Field Explorer gives us access to all of the columns in the inventory and item tables. Also gives us the ability to build formulas for mathematical calculations. Gives us the ability to create running totals or summaries, and build parameters, which are passed to the end user. We'll talk about some of those. So I'm going to dive into the item table first. And the first thing I want to include on the report is my item number. I want to know what it is we're talking about. So there's my item number. And you'll notice that I dropped the item number into the details row, and it dropped a text in the page header saying that this column is the item number. And I don't like item no, so I might change that to space pound symbol. So I can modify the column heading to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So I've got my item number, probably want to also include my description. And notice I'm dropping these on the tab stops. And again, we'll improve the description of the description. So we've got our description, our item number. Let's get the category as well. And I'm going to slide down. One of the hardest things of working with Crystal Reports is just finding the column you're looking for, because the tables can be pretty large with columns. So I'm going to drag in price 1, which is my selling price. And that's all I really want from my item table. So I've got generic item information. And from my inventory table, I'm probably concerned with my location, which is my warehouse, and how many I have on hand at each of those warehouses. So very quickly, I've dropped in a half dozen fields onto the report. And if I want to see what that looks like, I can click on the preview tab, and there's my data. So notice it's repeating each item 3 times for my east, my main, and my storage location. And at each one of those locations, I have different quantity on hands. So the next thing I want to build here, and well, I'm kind of running out of space. And the cosmetics of building a report are probably one of the more time-consuming components of it. Kind of shoehorning everything in and making sure it fits is takes a bit of work. And what we do for this is, if I click on a field, you'll notice there are 4 blue dots surrounding or anchoring the column. And if I hover over the right dot, I get a left-right arrow, and I can shrink it. If I hover over the field itself, I get a 4-way arrow, which allows me to move it. So I'm going to shrink the item number down. And remember, I said if I move the tab stop, it moves all of the columns that are linked to that tab stop. If I want to get rid of a tab stop that's not doing anything, like this one that I left at 2 inches, or 3 inches rather, just drag it up and it disappears. What I'm trying to do is make enough room for another formula here. So I've got my location and my quantity on hand. And so now I've got an extra inch worth of space on the right-hand side of the report. And what I want to do is I want to take my quantity on hand and my price 1 and produce a column for the retail value of the inventory. So to do that, I'm going to go into my formula fields. And if I right-click, I can choose new, or if I click on the little new button up on top, I can build a new formula. I'm going to call this retail value. And so now I'm in my formula editor. This is a fancy way of saying I've got scrap paper here where I can build my multiplication or my division or gross margin percentage formulas that I want to build. So retail value is pretty simple. I'm going to just take my quantity on hand and multiply it by my selling price. And so right in front of me, I have the fields that are already on the report that I can select. Or if I want to build something that is not already on the report, or using something that is not already on the report, I can expand the inventory table and grab my average cost or my standard cost for a cost basis valuation. But in this case, since I'm building the retail value, I can double click on my price, use the asterisk for times, and multiply that by my quantity on hand. So I'm going to take my selling price times my quantity on hand and save and close that. So now in my formula fields, I have a new field that I've built that's associated with this report, and I can drop that into the report just like I dropped in the category and everything else. And now if I look at my preview tab, I can see I've got $10,000 worth of jackets at my East location. And I could repeat the same thing with the cost or any other formulas that I wanted to build that way. We'll take a look at a margin formula here in a minute. So the next thing I want to do with this report is just looking at it, it's very redundant. I'm seeing, jacket 3 times. I'm seeing, 2-person golf 3 times. I'm seeing the same data over and over and over again. And what I want to do is I want to kind of crunch this down. I still want to have the location detail that shows me what's on hand and what it's worth at each of those locations, but I don't need to see the category 3 times for every item. I just need to see it once. So what I want to do is I want to group my data, and I want to group it by item. I might also want to group it by category to kind of keep things together. So I'm going to go back to the Design tab, and all of the work that I'm doing, I can do in either the Design tab or the Preview tab. But it's a little bit easier to see where to drop things in place on the Design tab than it is on the Preview tab. Sometimes some of the width edits and movement are a little bit easier on the Preview tab because you can get a sense of how much space you have to play with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the item number, and I'm going to talk about our first of our toolbar functions here, and that is inserting a group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a group based on the item number. And I can put my groups in ascending or descending order. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that later. And once I've selected to build a group based on the item number, you'll notice there's a group header and a group footer. And so if I preview this, the group header is highlighted in blue, which is the item number. And then within that, it repeats the rows of item number and inventory location and quantity and retail value for each of those items. So what this allows me to do is kind of move my description of my category up into that group header and eliminate those fields down below. So to do that, I'm just going to squeeze this a little bit closer, probably line that up. And I'm going to delete the item number down here because I don't need it again. With the description and the category and the price, I'm going to move those up to the group header line, and I can move them one at a time, or if I click and use the control key, I can move multiple fields at the same time and slide those up. So now if I preview the report, notice I've got my item number printed once, a little bit easier to read. I've got my description and category and selling price also listed just once. And then I've got my location specific detail. And this does 2 things for me. One, it makes the report a little bit easier to read because I'm not filling the page with the same information over and over again. And 2, this also gives me a lot more real estate down here where I could add additional formula information. So my first problem here is when I moved data up to my group header, I deleted the item number field. And when I deleted the item number field, it also automatically deleted my column heading. So I want to put a column heading in there that says item number, so I know what I'm looking at. So I'm going to click on this AB button, and that's going to allow me to drop text on the report. And so I'm just going to drag out a square to type, and I'll type in the word item number to replace what I had lost. And since I've got all of this real estate, I might want to move these columns left and put them underneath this information. And what I might do is move the column heading for location ID down over here, so I know what I'm looking at. And now I'm going to move these 3 fields over a bit. Let's park them right there. So if I preview the report, Now I've got my item number and my description information, and it's repeating the location ID for each of the locations, displaying the quantity and retail value. So the next thing I want to do here is I want to produce a gross margin formula. And I want to produce this one specifically, duplicating the retail value with a cost value is just pretty simple multiplication. Division is a little bit trickier. So I want to give you an example of that. So if I want to compute the gross margin of what I'm selling, I need my selling price, I need my average cost, and I need to do a division from the difference. So in my formula fields, I'm going to create a GM%. And I don't recommend using symbols in my names, or in your names, I should say. So I'll abbreviate percent as PERC. I don't like symbols in various places just because it can be interpreted by different things. So again, I'm back into that formula workshop where I can do my subtraction and my division. And this is a lot like 8th or 9th grade algebra, where parentheses really make a big difference. So I'm going to, and instead of selecting them from the available fields, I'll go find them, because I'm going to need to find a couple of them. So the first thing I have to do is I have to subtract my selling price minus my cost. So if I find my price 1, there you are. And I'm going to subtract, and I'm going to subtract the average cost from the inventory record. So this margin is going to be location specific. Where's my average cost? There you are. Okay, so when I'm doing the subtraction, I want to do that subtraction first before I divide. So I'm going to put that in parentheses. We remember our algebra. And so I'm going to divide that by my selling price to compute the margin percent. So that's a kind of a standard margin calculation. And if I want to make that appear as a percent, I can multiply by 100. And if I save and close this, I can drag that out. Now, kind of doing this on purpose to show you some errors that you're going to see. That. If I have an item that I sell for $0, Crystal Report Writer is going to try and do the division by 0, which we can't do. You try that on a calculator, you'll get an E. So I have to build a condition into my gross margin percent to handle the condition where the selling price is 0. I'm going to do that with an if statement. And so now we start getting into a little bit more code, but it's a pretty simple if statement. And Ryan's going to send you a Word doc that's going to have all of this detail. So you're not going to have to memorize this or tattoo it on your forearm like I did. So when I type the word if, notice it lights up in blue. And so if my selling price, if my price 1 is not equal to 0, I don't need spaces here, but it reads a little bit nicer if you space things out. Then we're going to do something. So an if statement is if a condition exists, then do this. If it doesn't exist, do something else. That's the raw vernacular of it. So if my price is not 0, then we can do the division. Else, 0. And so what I'm saying here is if the selling price is 0, then the gross margin percentage is going to be 0. So we're going to output 0 in the condition that our selling price is 0. So now if I save and close this and preview the report, notice where my selling price was 0, my gross margin is 0. So the next thing I want to build onto this report, we've kind of built a group by item. I also want to group my items by category or department to keep them all together. And so I can click on the category and use the group, which we used before. Or I want to show you another function. And so this is a simple group function, which builds a group based on whatever you've selected. If you have nothing selected, if you click the button, you can choose how you want to group the data. But once you start building multiple groups, I don't recommend using the insert group function. There's a function a couple buttons over, which is the group expert. Crystal Report Writer likes to use the word expert in everything, you'll notice. So the group expert allows me to create a second group and also determine the order of groups. And that's why I like using the group expert once I get further along into the report. And so I'm going to create a group by the category, but I want my category to be my first group. So if I click on that and hit the up arrow, I can make the category my first break. So I'm going to group all of my data by category, and within the categories, I'm going to group my data by item. So now I have all of my apparel together, my jackets and hats and coats and pants. And I have all my food together, probably in the kitchen. Notice beer comes first because it's the most important food group. And golf comes last because it's a walk spoiled. So once I've grouped my data, and again, I'm grouping it by both item and by category, I might want to summarize how many I have on hand for each of these products and what their cost value or what their retail value is worth. So if I come back to my design tab, notice I've got a group 1, and in the bottom left-hand corner, when I click on that, you'll notice it says item category code. And if I click on group header 2 in the bottom left-hand corner, it says it's grouped by the item number. I can also see what the group method is if I just hover over the section. I can see that group 1 is the category and group 2 is the item number. And when you start getting into more complex reports or you start modifying purchase order forms or invoice forms, you may have 5 or 6 different group levels, which makes it kind of hard to trace through what's where. And you want to place things in the appropriate sections. So now that I've got data grouped by both category and item, I want to summarize the quantity on hand and the retail value of the products. So if I click on the quantity on hand and hit the Sigma button, I can insert a summary. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add the quantity on hand for each of the items at each of the locations. And if you're on an older version of Crystal Report Writer, you don't have this handy dandy checkbox that says add to all group levels. I love this little box. If you don't have that, you have to build the summary 3 times. But what I've just done here is I've summarized the on-hand quantity by item, by category, and by grand total. And I don't have to put my summaries in the footer section. I might want to put the item quantity on hand up on the item header like that. And I'm going to do the same thing with the retail value. Again, I'll hit the insert summary. And if I didn't build it in all levels, I can choose which level I wanted to put it in. So I want to put it in the item number section. And I'll drag it up. And I'll repeat that and put that in the category section. And repeat it one last time and put it in the grand total. So now if I preview that, for each item, I have the total quantity on hand, the total retail value of the item, as well as the individual location-specific details. And you'll notice there's a blank line in here, which is this report footer section. There's a couple different things I can do to if I don't want to display that. I can scrunch it smaller to hide it, or I might suppress it. And to suppress a section, there's a button over here that's called the section expert. You can also access that by right-clicking and choosing the section expert. And the section expert allows me to take my item number footer and suppress the section. We can conditionally suppress fields. We'll get a little bit more into that on Thursday's session. So now if I look at this, I've lost that blank line, kind of consolidates the report a little bit. These are cosmetic things, but make the report a little bit more readable. Notice I did not summarize the gross margin percentage. And the reason for that, and this shirt is a really good example, is, well, first of all, I don't want to add up the percentages. If I do, I'm going to have approximately 145% margin on this particular product if I just add those numbers. That's not an accurate representation of the gross margin percentage of that product. So if I want to calculate the overall gross margin percentage of the shirt at all of my locations, what I really need to do is look at the total, the sum of the cost and the sum of the retail, do the subtraction, and do the division based on my summary figures. So I want to go ahead and do that to show you what that would look like. And some of these fields we don't really have available yet. So I've got the total retail value, but I don't have the total cost value. So I'm going to build a formula for that. And call this cost value. And again, I'm just going to take my average cost and multiply it by my quantity on hand. So there's my average cost times my quantity on hand. And I'll save and close that. And I'm going to drop that into the report, at least temporarily. I'm not going to keep it there. And once I've got that in my details section, I'm going to summarize it. And I'm going to add that to all of my levels or all of my layers. So now I've got the total cost per item, total cost per category, and the grand total cost. So now that's going to allow me to build this gross margin percent using the total retail value and the total cost values. So I'm going to build 3 different gross margin percentages: item, category, and grand total. So if I click new, and I'll call this item GM percent. Notice now in my report section, I've added a lot more fields to my report. I have group 1 summaries, group 2 summaries, and report summaries. So since this is the item gross margin, I want to pick the fields that say group 2 item number. So they tell you what the grouping mechanism is. So I want my retail minus my cost divided by my retail. So again, it's the same if then else statement and parentheses. So I'll take my retail value, subtract my cost value, close the parenthesis, and divide that by the retail value. And I still have to handle the potential that it might be 0. So if this retail value is not equal to 0, then we'll run the formula. And if it is 0, we'll output a 0. So I can save and close that. Don't forget the word then. And so now I can drag that gross margin percentage in and drop it in my gross margin percentage column. And I can repeat that for the other two layers. And again, since this is the category gross margin percentage, I'm going to use the category retail value minus the category cost value and divide that by the category retail value. And if it is 0, we'll output 0. And if you look at that formula, it looks like a whole lot of words and verbiage in there. I didn't have to type any of that. When I selected the field, it really put all of this in place for me. Now if I preview the report, I want to multiply those by 100 to make them look like percentages, or there's a percent function. Which will add the percent symbol. In my report expert, or my formula expert, I can jump from one formula to another. So if I had to add the 100 to multiply by 100 here, I can do that, and then I can come over to the category gross margin percentage and make the same corresponding change and save it. So I don't have to come in and out of this screen so often. So now I have a blended gross margin percent of 42.95% on the shirts. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save that real quick. Probably should have saved already. And right now I'm going to save this in just a webinar folder. I'm going to call this COVID-1. But if I wanted to use this within Counterpoint, I would save this in my Counterpoint directory. So on my server's program files x86, I'm going to find my Radiant Systems and Counterpoint, and I have two different instances of Counterpoint installed. What I'm looking for is the top level directory, and within the top level directory, you might have a, Corning Museum of Glass or the Red Sox or whatever the company name is. And within that, there's a configuration folder. And in the configuration folder, there's two folders that we are concerned with when we talk about Crystal Report Writer. One is the reports folder, and the other is the PS forms folder. So PS forms deal with invoice forms and sales order forms or layaway forms or hold forms, receipts. And the reports folder is really everything else. So purchase orders, receiver forms, inventory reports, sales history reports would all be parked here. So I'm going to save that report into my reports folder. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. There's a few other cosmetic changes I want to make to this report before we make it a little bit more complicated. And so I probably want to give it a title. I want to give it a date. I want to give it a page number. So up on my report header, I want to give myself a little bit more room so I can just drag the bar down a little bit, give myself a ½ inch. And I want to give it a title. So if I click on the Insert Text object, I can drag out, and I want to center this title, so I'll make my box the whole width of the page, and we'll call this COVID-1. And I want to make that a much larger font, and I want to bold it, and I want to center it. So because the box is the width of the page, when I click center, it's nicely centered on the page. And the next thing I want to do is I want to give it the date and the page number. So over on the right-hand side in my Field Explorer, under Special Fields, there's two fields we use all the time, which are print date and page number. And we just drag those in just like any other field. So I drop my print date in, and I want to format the print date. There's a couple different date formats, and I don't like the default one. So if I right-click and choose Format Field, and you'll see that everywhere. And because it's a date field, I have date choices. If it was a text field or a numeric field, I would have different options. And so I want to go with a short date format, just like that. With the page number, I don't like just having a random number floating in the upper right-hand corner of my page. I want to put the word page number there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the AB button and drop in another text box. And I'm going to type in the word page number, colon. I'll put a space there so it reads nicely. And notice I'm on that field. It's still highlighted in blue. And I'm just going to select the page number and drop that into my box. So now I've got the text of page number and the field of the page number. So I've embedded the database field from Crystal Report Writer into a text field. If I preview that, now it says page number 1 and page number, well, we'll get page number 2 in a second. And there's my short date. So since I put those two fields, the date and the page number, in the report header, they're only going to appear on the top of the first page. So I might want to put those in the page header as well. And so I want to give myself a little bit more room there for that. If I want to move all of the objects in the field, if I right-click over on the side, I can select all section objects. Come on. There we go. Notice they're all lit up, and I can just drag them all down simultaneously. So that gives me room here for the print date and the page number. And I can copy and paste those. So Control-C and Control-V allows me to duplicate those fields. Now, if I preview this, it's going to look a little bit funny on my first page. Notice I've got the date twice and the page number twice, but when I get onto my second page, it looks fine. I just have it appearing once. So if I go back to my design, what I want to do is I want to conditionally suppress these two fields. I don't want to print them twice on the first page. So what that means is in the page header section, I don't want to print these. I don't want these to appear if we're on page number 1. So I want to format those two objects. Again, just like we formatted the date format, using the format text allows me to determine whether or not they appear on the page. And I can do them simultaneously. So again, if I hit the Control key and select both objects and right-click and format the objects, what I want to do is I want to suppress them. But I don't want to always suppress them. If I was going to always suppress them, why would I even put them on the page? So if I want to suppress them conditionally, I'll choose to suppress them, and then I'll hit the formula button, which allows me to build a condition on when they are suppressed. The condition is I want to suppress them on page number 1. And I can type that in, and notice it lights up in blue as a keyword. So that's the condition. If you didn't know that the keyword was page number, you can find that in the print state and page number should be in here. There it is. So instead of typing it in, you can go find the values and select them and build your condition. So notice now this formula button is in red, indicating it's conditionally suppressed. It's not always suppressed. And notice that once they're suppressed, they kind of turn a light gray, indicating that they're suppressed. So now if I go back to my first page, I haven't duplicated the page number or the date. And if I go to the second page, it's appearing once. And notice here it's appearing in the page header section. And on the first page, it's appearing in the report header section, but not the page header section. But notice if you click on the area, the field is still there. It's just invisible. So again, I'm going to save that. And there's one more thing I want to put into my report header. And this sounds a little bit like gibberish when we first start doing this, but it's really important when you're building reports that you're going to use within Counterpoint. And it's a special little code word. So I'm going to click on the AB to drop in a text box, and I usually drop it over here. And I usually make this pretty wide. And what I'm going to type in this text box is going to be % user filter %, just like that. And what this does is when you put this report into Counterpoint and the end user filters the data in Counterpoint looking for items from a specific vendor or where you have a quantity on hand greater than 0 or whatever they filter using the standard Counterpoint filtering system appears on the first page of the report. Really the same way all the standard Counterpoint reports work. And that's how it replaces this, just serves as a variable, and it's replaced with what the end user supplies. And the nice thing about that is if somebody gives you a report that says, and they say, this doesn't make any sense, you can look and see how they executed the report, so you're able to duplicate it. And one last thing I want to do with this user filter is, as some of you know, filters in Counterpoint can be pretty lengthy. If you're filtering based on, it being in one of 10 different categories, that might go on for several lines. So what I'll do is, just like I formatted the date and the page number, if I right-click and format the text, I'm going to check this Can Grow box. What that does is it just allows this field to scale downward, so it has enough room to print all of the details that were built into the end user's filter. So the next thing I want to do with this report is, well, I said we were going to pull out that cost value. We were just using that as a placeholder for our gross margin percentages. But I want to add some sales history to this report. And so right now my report is built on item and inventory data, nothing sales history oriented at all, but I want to kind of shoehorn that into the report as an additional column. So to do that, I need to pull data from ticket history. And so I'm going to go to my database expert. I told you they use the word expert a lot in these functions. So if I go to my database expert, when we first started this whole project, we said we were going to use the item and inventory tables. Well, now I'm also going to use a ticket history table. And so if I slide down into my point of sale, ticket history line table, I can select that. And now I have to link that data. And notice it's trying to link the ticket history table to the item number table, which is not quite right. So I'm going to delete that link. And what I want to do, when I sell inventory, I probably sell it out of a store. Well, these days, I guess we're selling it on the sidewalks, but I want to link my sales history to my inventory record because it's location specific. So I'm going to link the item number in the inventory record to the item number in the ticket history line table. And then my location ID is probably going to correspond with my store ID. Doesn't always necessarily work that way, but for our purposes, we'll do it that way. And a more accurate way of doing it would really be to link the location ID to the stock location ID. And the stock location ID represents the warehouse that the product was sold from the date it was sold, as opposed to the store where the sale transaction transpired. And so I want to talk a little bit about these links real quick. What I have now is show me everything that's in items, the corresponding inventory records, and the corresponding sale records. And the way these links are working right now is I will only see items and inventory records that have corresponding sales records. Well, I may have a brand new product that just came in the door that I want to know about, but I haven't sold any yet. And the way this is working, I won't see that data. And so to see that data, I want to change these links. And to change the link, I can either go to link options or I can right click on the link and choose link options. And I want to make that a left outer join. So when I laid out the tables earlier, I said I like to make the most important table on the left. The reason for that is we use the terms left outer join or right outer join, and I always like to work from left to right. So when I made this a left outer join, notice it puts arrows here, meaning it's going from left to right. And this is saying, give me all the items, give me all the inventory records, and if there happens to be some sales history for them, show me that also. But if the sales history doesn't exist, I still want to see the items and the inventory that I have on hand. So I'm gonna just move some things over here a little bit so I've got enough room. And notice with the retail value, I didn't drop a tab, so if I want to move them, I have to move them, select them all, rather than just drag the tab. So that gives me enough room here to put in a quantity sold, or sales dollars, or whatever else I want to summarize. So from my ticket history line tab, fields I'm probably most interested in would be quantity sold and the extended price. So the extended price represents how much money we took in for the product, and the quantity sold represents how many of them walked out the door. So let's just play with quantity sold as a simple column for starters. And I'm going to drag that into my details section. And if I preview this, my report's going to go a little haywire. Perfect. So here's my jacket, and notice at location main, it's listing it out about a dozen times because I sold 4 of them, and then I sold 8 of them, and I sold 33 of them, and I sold 4 of them, so on and so forth. And while this makes the report a lot longer, the worst piece of that is it inflates my totals. So let's build a total for the quantity sold, and we'll come back and talk about the quantity on hand and the retail values. So for my quantity sold, again, I'm going to hit the summary button to summarize how many I've sold. And I'll add that to all of my sections. And I'll drag this one up into the item total, the same way I did with the quantity on hand and the retail value. So I sold 137 of them, but my on-hand inventory really don't add up to these numbers. So I have to fix those 2 things. And since I have to fix those 2 things, I probably want to just delete those 2 fields. Some other quick formatting things I might do in terms of housekeeping. With quantities, I don't like to display the decimals. I can get rid of them by decreasing the decimals. Might do the same thing with the quantity on hand. And getting rid of decimals just gives me a little more real estate on the page. So what I need to do here, instead of summarizing my quantity on hand, like I did earlier, I have to build a running total. And so a running total summarizes the column, but I'm able to choose when I want to do the addition. So I'm going to build a new running total, and Crystal does a horrible job in naming these running totals, and I recommend naming them something logical, where you're going to put them. So this is going to be the item quantity on hand, so I'm going to call it item YOH. So if I look at the field, I know where it belongs. And the field that I want to summarize is going to be the quantity on hand. So just like I used the sum to sum the quantity on hand, I'm doing the same thing here, but I'm able to choose at what stage as we go through the list we're actually doing the addition. And we want to summarize the quantity on hand, in this particular instance, on the change of the field of the location. So when we get to the east location, we want to add the quantity on hand. When we move from east to main, we want to add the quantity on hand. And when we move from main to storage, we want to add the quantity on hand. We don't want to add it every time we've sold the product. And so we're adding that up per item, and we want to reset that counter or that total back to 0 when we change to the next item number. So this running total was for the item quantity on hand. We could do the same thing based on the category on hand, so we could have a category total. And just like the formula fields, I can drag the running on hand onto my report. There we go. And you'll notice, I can actually move this and you can see it. If I put the running total at the bottom of the column, it adds correctly. If I drag it to the top, it's only going to give me 216. It's going to give me the first row because that's the only one it knows yet. And I would do the same thing for the retail value. And I'll summarize the retail value on the change of the location. And I'll reset, we reset item numbers. And that looks like 10,000 plus 8,000 plus 4,000. Much more accurate totals. Now with that in mind, I don't want to see this location stuff over and over and over again. And so what I might do from a cosmetic standpoint is we built groups for the category and for the item. I might also build a group for the location. And to do that, I would go back to the location expert, or group expert rather, and choose to build a group by location. And then I could put those running totals into, or I could put the, the current on hands and retail values into the group footer and suppress the detail section. So what that would look like, I'm just going to drag them down. And with the quantity sold, I'm going to summarize that by location. So if I preview that, I've really just moved my totals into the location footers. And now I can get rid of or suppress all of these location ID fields or column rows. And so if I go back to my section expert, I can suppress the details section. It kind of looks like it did before. And I can suppress the group header as well to put them one on top of each other. like that. So again, it looks the way it did before, but we're building our totals in a different manner. We're using running totals instead of a summary. But in this instance, I'm using a summary for the quantity sold because that's really the basis of each detail row. But for the retail value and the on hand, I'm using those running totals because I have to evaluate them later on in a separate pass to prevent me from multiplying the on hand based on the number of times the product was sold. That takes us to 11:59. I could not have timed the full hour closer if I had tried. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, John. That was great. This may have been answered earlier because this question was from a while ago, but can you wrap the header rows?
Sure, absolutely. So like category code, just make it double high.
Is that what you were asking, Arlene?
So all I did was I made it taller and put a carriage return for a line break.
Yep, that answers your question. Thanks. That's all I'm seeing coming through. Anybody else have any questions?
That was a lot of material to hammer through in 1 hour. We're going to pick up on this with our second section and talk about date parameters and some other stuff with this same layout and same type of report, and drop it into Counterpoint to see how it looks in Counterpoint. So if you have follow-up questions, we can address them in round 2 as well.
Great. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. Do these export into Excel easily?
I would say the reports you build yourself in Crystal will export better than the Counterpoint ones do. The more footers and headers you have, the more of those empty rows you'll get in Excel, especially if you choose Excel as the format instead of Excel data only. But you're a lot, you have much more control in terms of lining up your columns when you build the report yourself. We can export one of these and see what it looks like in Excel in our next round.
Great. Yeah, Arlene asked if we could cover this in the next one, so that's great.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all for attending, and I hope you all stay healthy and get outside and enjoy some sunshine, but avoid your neighbors. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.